Welcome to the Electric Wire Podcast. We bring you news and views on the most pressing issues facing Wisconsin's electric industry, from policymakers, executives, and customer and environmental advocates. Bringing you these discussions, we are the Customers First Coalition. Here's your host, Executive Director Kristin Gilkes.
Welcome, everybody, to the Electric Wire Podcast, episode 23. I'm Kristin Gilkes. I'm so happy to be joined today by Cari Anne Renlund. Welcome, Cari Anne.
Hi, Kristin. Thank you very much for having me.
Cari Anne is the Vice President, General Counsel, and Secretary of Madison Gas and Electric, an investor-owned community energy company in Madison, Wisconsin. She is the officer in charge of legal and risk management, safety, sustainability and environmental affairs, legislative affairs, and NERC compliance and generation operations. She is also a board member of the Customers First Coalition. That's a pretty big list there, Cari Anne.
It's a good list. It's a fun one.
Well, today's episode focuses on the future of utilities, and we had two incredible women from the industry join us. We had Rebecca Ryan, who is a futurist, and we had Lauren Azar, who is a former public service commissioner here in Wisconsin, a senior advisor to the U.S. Secretary of Energy, and one of America's most respected utility attorneys. She's a valuable partner in bringing new technologies to market and assisting traditional utilities as their respected advisor. And as you'll hear later in this episode, she is also becoming a bionic woman if she's not already. So you'll have to listen more for that. Cari Anne, I'll read Rebecca Ryan's bio really quick, and then I want to get a couple thoughts from you on your take on the episode before we get started.
Got it.
So Rebecca Ryan, as I mentioned, she's a futurist, an economist, and a gifted communicator and thought leader, as you will definitely see in this episode. Rebecca is the founder of Futurist Camp, inventor of Future Labs, and owner of Next Generation Consulting. She's a faculty member and board chair at the Institute for Zen Leadership. And I felt like our episode with her really ended on a Zen note. It was inspiring and thought-provoking, and it was really an honor to have both of them join us for this podcast.
I agree with you very much, Kristin. I really think that we're so fortunate to have these two women with very different specialties who are both really have the kinds of experience to help all of us through this transformation that we're making in our industry. You know, though Rebecca is not an energy or utility industry expert, she is an expert on all things change, you know, all things that are ahead. And how do we open our minds in order to make that kind of transformational change and be welcome to it? And she's just a fantastic partner and leader in that effort. And Lauren, you know, like you said, is the, you know, local utility and energy expert. And we're so fortunate to have her right here in Madison, right here in Wisconsin at our disposal. We're just really, really, really lucky. And you can tell by listening to her too, she knows that transformational change is afoot. And she too is helping her clients with that from the industry expert perspective.
It really is incredible to hear them both together. And like I said, it was a really thought-provoking and very fun episode to do. And we're calling this episode The Future of Utilities. And there's a line in here where Rebecca is proposing that utilities will become technology companies that also sell electrons. So that's part of this transformation, is the new technologies driving the energy transition. There is a role for utilities, and they are making this transition to the future. Let's turn it over now to our conversation with Rebecca and Lauren. And thank you, Cari Anne, for joining me as co-host.
Anytime, Kristin. Thanks for having me.
Well, welcome, Rebecca. Welcome, Lauren. Thank you so much for joining Cari Anne and I today.
You're welcome. Great to be here.
Our pleasure.
So Rebecca, start us out. Give us a frame of reference. What is a futurist? What is it that you do every day?
It's a great question. I get it all the time. Like, is futuring really a thing? I didn't know that was a thing. I think the easiest way to explain it is the job of a historian is to try to make sense of the past. The job of a journalist is to report what's happening in the present. And the job of people in my profession, as professional futurists, our job is to try to make sense of what is happening, what's emerging, and what's coming. So we spend a lot of time evaluating trends, helping think about emerging futures, what's likely to happen. So depending on when your audience is listening to this, there may or may not be a war happening. And we try to anticipate, depending on where we work, we try to anticipate the implications that different events will have on our clients.
And Lauren, welcome as well. We're just honored to have you here. So tell us a little bit about the projects you two have been working on together and just generally what you're up to right now.
Yeah, absolutely. And let me just add on to what Rebecca said with regards to futuring and why it's so appropriate right now in the utility industry is, when folks do strategic planning, they often look at history to sort of extrapolate into the future on a linear basis. But we are in a period of such dramatic change in the electric industry right now that kind of planning won't work. Instead, doing the kind of things that Rebecca has an expertise in, namely looking at the trends and trying to figure out in the far future, where are we going and what are sort of the possible futures for the industry is really what utilities need to be looking at right now, just because of how unpredictable our lives are. So Rebecca and I have been working together with a few utilities, she obviously brings the futuring or forecasting methodology to the process, and I bring the subject matter expertise with regards to identifying the trends that the utilities are going through, as well as some regulatory changes that are likely to sort of send the utilities in different sorts of directions. I can say, with regards to a project that we just recently completed with the utility, it was a large public power entity, and its board tasked it with becoming net zero carbon by 2050. The utility itself was quite siloed, as we know many utilities are. I can say, at least from my perspective, each of the silos was sort of rowing in their own direction. And what Rebecca's facilitation was able to do and able to pull out of them was essentially a North Star by which all of the boats could start rowing towards each other towards 2050. The purpose of it wasn't to come up with a definitive plan, but it was to come up with a direction and to help all the silos start working together. And I can say, with regards to the executive team there, what a fundamental change we witnessed over the project in their perspective of their own work, as well as the perspective of how they worked with the other executive team members.
So how important do you think that goal setting process is to get people on the same page? Do you think that the state and federal goals are reasonable, and do we need more of that, or how localized do people need to be getting with these goals?
Well, let me just say it's a great question, and I'm going to give you an example, because I actually think the state and utility goals. Now, utilities, I think all of the big utilities in Wisconsin have essentially promised their shareholders that they were going to reach certain goals by a certain time period. And those goals actually are driving the amount of carbon that's likely to be reduced, at least in the MISO footprint. MISO recently has been doing a long-term plan, and taking a look at that, they were going to force in a 40% reduction in carbon. But once they put in the utility and state goals in the MISO footprint, they actually experienced a 63% reduction in carbon by the year 2039. So that was a pretty dramatic result. And I can say I was surprised. And it also just lets you know that I know folks say, well, what if you can't reach consensus on the goals? It doesn't matter. If we're driving towards those kind of goals that states have promised to their citizens and utilities have promised to their shareholders, we are going to end up with a cleaner grid and a cleaner generation portfolio.
Cari Anne, do you want to talk about MGEs goals? Because I know you guys have actually been pushing up your goals as you go along.
Yeah, thank you for the opportunity to jump in, because I agree with Lauren 100% that industry actually led the carbon goals here. Without government, in the absence of consensus goals on the US or global scale, really, and instead, investors and customers led the way, which I think you got to give a lot of credit to human beings for doing that, right? Because they got their companies that they invest, they put the money where their mouth is and to lead in this regard. And so I think it is critical. And we are facing, a gap in how we're going to achieve these goals. MGE has a 2050, by 2050, net zero carbon electricity is our goal. And we recently updated our 2030 goal to an 80% reduction. We believe will be at least an 80% reduction in carbon emissions by 2030. We'll have added 400 megawatts of wind and solar energy by 2024. So these are things, when I started at MG 7 years ago, I could not have said with a straight face to you that I would believe we could have done that so quickly. It's really remarkable. And industry, I think, really is doing that. We set then the course. We make research and development and technology companies comfortable making their investments because they know there's a market. And that's a good thing. That said, government goals are important and can be helpful. The electric industry is moving in this way. Some other industries are just getting there, right? Transportation among them. If you look at the other big carbon emitting industries, transportation is getting there. But government goals, believe it or not, did help the electric industry make this change. There are tax credits out there for wind and solar investments that made those technologies economic compared to fossil generating assets. It was bipartisan congressional legislation, if you can believe it. And it's been very helpful. So those weren't goals, but it was government policy that certainly helped us in getting there. And it continues to help us.
Do you think cost is the biggest driver, or do you think the policy goals were the biggest driver? Just curious, what's going to keep us going on this trajectory?
In my view, I think it's both. It's almost a chicken and the egg. Again, you've got the industry setting goals, responding to its customers, responding to its investors and setting goals, and then perhaps going to the government and asking, for a little bit of help or urging, for incentives in order to help us get there. We're going to have to continue to do that. So I think it's, it can be a government policy and then the industry responds, or an industry policy, the government responds. But I just don't want to lose sight of the fact that, the everyday citizen has had a big role in this by, being active consumers and investors and urging the industry to move where government was not.
And Kristin, I think that the drop in cost in solar and wind probably started the chicken and egg process, because I don't believe utilities actually would have moved as quickly as they had the cost not dropped as much as they did. So
if you think of it, Lauren, from your regulator perspective, what we need to go through in order to get our projects approved. And you have to prove that they're cost effective. You have to prove that they're necessary. You have to prove that they're cost effective. We wouldn't have gotten those projects approved if we couldn't have shown that they were cost effective. And those tax credits were a critical piece of that.
So do you think policies need to change? Anyone want to weigh in on that? Lauren, I know I can get you to. Should cost be the driver, or do we have enough right now? Should states be doing more, Or do you feel like this is like, we're talking about this industry-led transition, obviously, as Cari Anne was saying, led by customers?
I still think regulatory barriers are one of the biggest challenges our industry has and are preventing the industry from transforming as quickly as it could be. So do policies have to change? Absolutely. Yeah, I'll stop there.
Okay, so Rebecca, how do we get regulators and policymakers to start thinking like futurists?
Yeah, I think it's a useful question. I don't know that I've absolutely cracked the nut, but here's one thing that I would say around this, which is, if you believe that your future will simply be linear, a linear extension of what always has been, there's very little need for you to think like a futurist. You can just rinse, repeat, like Lauren said. You can take your goals for 2025 and just do a find and replace in Microsoft Word and update it to 2030 and be like, pish posh, my work is done. So I think the first key is for people to think back and ask, 10 years from now, will our future consumers be consuming energy in the same way that they are now? And if the answer is yes, proceed with the way you always have. And if the answer is no, grab a friend and start an exploration of the future. And because that's what I think has been the most useful with our clients, right? So Cari Anne works inside of one of our clients. She's at MGE, and we've done 2 projects on foresight with MGE. We've done one with this public power utility that Lauren mentioned. And you have to have a posture of curiosity to think like a futurist. If you think you would have the answers, you're already behind the 8 ball. And I'll give you, like, one of the things that drives me crazy is when CEOs of utility companies say, well, we have Monte Carlo scenarios, that's our foresight. That is such a tiny sliver of what we're talking about. As an example, with the public power utility, we had their top 12 executives work for hours, almost an entire day, with 50 trends that we knew were going to come true over the course of the next 20 years. 50 trends that we knew were going to come true, including the fact that they were going to have more people living in poverty in their region if current trends persisted. There would be far fewer people in single-family homes. They would be a minority population, so they would have more people of color than white people in their community. And when these executives had to look at these 50 trends, only a handful of which had anything to do with deregulation or energy policy, they took a broader look at their community and said, oh my God, will we be viable and relevant in the next 20 years? So curiosity is required. You have to be curious about what's coming to think like a futurist. And then you have to be willing to do the mental gymnastics, the hard work to raise your eyes to the horizon. And as Lauren said, not think in your silo. You're a subject matter expert in your silo. But are you willing to get out of your silo and see your utility as your customers see it? To see electricity as tomorrow's 30-year-old, today's 10-year-old sees it. There's a series of different things that are required to think like a futurist.
I love it. So you talked about some of these trends that you had the executives work with. What's going to happen in 10 years? What are the top trends you think that, living here in Wisconsin, what should we be forecasting for the next 10 years?
Yeah, well, we know that Wisconsin's population has been getting older, right? So if you fast forward that overall, we know that people also tend to get poorer as they get older. There's a few people who concentrate their wealth, but overall, we're at the end of our earning, we're at the end of our savings, so we're getting older. We continue to be a less healthy overall state, right? Our health metrics aren't necessarily going in that direction. And we also know some things about the educational attainment of the population as a whole. So when you think about what will be required from the perspective of, and this is Wisconsin as a whole. If you look at the big metro areas, different things are changing, right? What's happening in the Fox Valley and what's happening in Milwaukee and what's happening in Madison and South Central Wisconsin, every utility should focus on their geographic delivery area and think about the demographic changes, the technology changes that are going to face their community. But what we also know overall is that more of our lives will be electrified. So thinking back, okay, so let's say our community is getting older, right? We know that our parents and grandparents are probably going to be getting telemedicine from home. They are probably going to have, medical technology that's going to be required sometimes 24/7. So the utilities' role in life and death is going to be increased in the future. There are going to be more needs for more people. Think about online education. I think we can all foresee a day when there will be a population for whom online education is the way that these students and their parents are going to want them to be educated. For that to happen, we've got to be completely electrified, and frankly, high-speed internet needs to be seen as a public good, right? So there's just no future that where utilities are less important, but utilities' relationships with their clients, with their customers, I think needs a fundamental rethink. Because if we want our utilities to be inside our homes in the same way that Alexa and OK Google and Siri are inside our homes, that is a huge opportunity. And I think especially in this day and age, I think the utility is more of a trusted partner than some of these large technology companies. And that is a huge opportunity for utilities to get behind the meter, to create, to not only get more information about how their customers use energy, but be more useful to customers in how they use energy.
Rebecca, on that point, it just makes me think of the MGE service territory in particular, because our company MGE Energy are, parent as an entity where we're one of the smallest investor-owned utilities in the country, but we also have one of the largest retail owners. We have, like more than 50% of our investors live here and have held our stock for ever and ever and ever. Back pre-pandemic, we had a very extremely large in-person annual meeting held at the Marriott West, where, nearly 2,000 people came to our annual meeting in person, and their average age was, I would guess, over 70. If I, had to guess, and those are people, really important people who have held our stock for a really long time, and they trust us, and they've trusted us to, provide them with a dividend, and they've provided it, and they've trusted us to provide them safe and reliable and affordable energy for their entire lives. So we do come with credibility, and that is a real opportunity in our relationship with folks like that. We see technology barriers, though. Those individuals are also the same ones who had difficulty adapting to us having to go online for our annual meeting, because, we had, a percentage of folks literally dialing in and using landline telephones to participate. So there's still impediments there, but there's a real opportunity. I would agree with you.
And Kristin, with regards to trends that are industry specific in Wisconsin, some of the ones to think about, of course, are extreme weather. I would think about continued competition that the utilities are going to see, especially with implementation of such things as FERC Order 222, which is going to enable aggregators to bid into the market. The trends with regards to cost reductions in wind, solar, batteries, and other kinds of technologies, I think are also going to be very important for our utilities to continue to watch. And one of my favorites is the small modular nuclear reactors. So we'll see where those come along. As an example of a few trends our utilities should be watching.
I love it. Thank you. And the small nuclear reactors to me are so intriguing as well. I want to do a whole episode on that. So we might need to have you back in the future as well. Talk
Sure.
about that. As you know, I was thinking of calling this episode The Future of Utilities. So with all those factors in mind, what is the future of utilities? Rebecca.
Let the least qualified person respond to this, please. With all of the utility companies that I've worked with, we always go through that trend sorting process that I mentioned earlier. And we basically we create a visual display of these trends. And what these large visual displays of these trends tell me is that every one of these utilities is actually transforming from a utility that delivers through some technology channels to a technology company that happens to deliver electrons. That, to me, is the future of utilities.
I think you're right. And the role has changed so much. You touched on electrification once already, but I wanted to talk more about that because traditionally the utility delivers the power and now they're delivering a transportation fuel as well for those electric vehicle owners. And I wanted to pick your brain a little bit, Cari Anne, and then hear from both you, Rebecca and Lauren, about how you see the utilities role changing as they deliver transportation fuel now, and just thoughts on electrification in general and how that's changing the industry.
I would agree with what Rebecca just said about, the utilities becoming, a technology company that delivers electrons. I would agree with that. I mean, we're still going to be, generating it in a whole variety of different ways, as opposed to just owning, a coal plant and a gas plant. Right? We're now going to have all kinds of different ways and methods that the technology or that the generation is being produced. And it's going to be in multiple different locations and multiple different sizes. And so we're also still going to be in the business of, owning and operating and maintaining the grid for which to distribute that energy. And we look at ourselves, a word we've used a lot is like the conductor of the orchestra. Because there's all these different, there's your horn section, your, percussion and your strings and whatever. And somebody has to keep it all together. And that's really how we see, the future of the utility as our role changing in that regard.
Thanks.
I can jump in here and answering somewhat of your last question too, where utilities are heading. Without some sort of fundamental technological change, utilities will remain the provider of last resort, which really reemphasizes exactly what Cari Anne was just saying, that they're going to be maintaining the distribution grid. They're going to ensure that there's sufficient resources to deliver to their customers. And as you noted, Kristin, to keep their customers alive and to keep their vehicles rolling. And so the role of utilities is really going to grow in the future, absent some really significant technology change.
What do you think, Rebecca? Do you think that everybody's going to be driving around in an electric vehicle in 10 years?
I'm so glad you asked this question. The short answer is, I don't know. But the longer answer is, and for anybody who's listening to this podcast who's like, oh, foresight, is that really a thing? And I'd like to test drive my foresight. Oh, I wanted to share screen with you guys. There's this process called the Good Judgment Project. And it trains people how to be super forecasters. It's based on the book Super Forecasting that came out probably almost 10 years ago now. But the Good Judgment Project invites any of us to come in and look at a question. So the EV question has been a question on the Good Judgment Project for years. So there is some research now that's, the question is, what percentage of all light vehicle sales in the US will be either plug-in hybrids or all electric vehicles in 2022? And we've had 73 forecasters just this month weigh in on this question, with over 238 different forecasts. And if you believe in hive mind, 88% say that there will be over 4% of all EV sales in 2022, of all car sales will be EV sales in just in this year. There's also been, I think, some amazing research done on when technology tips, right? So first of all, any technology that can hang around for 10 years has got some staying power, e.g., I see you, Bitcoin. But EVs are the same way, right? These have been around for a while now. And so once you hit that 10-year platform, the tip rate tends to go more quickly. So I don't know if we're going to hit 100% in a decade, Kristin, but we're going to get there. And we'll probably always have those holdouts, right?
I agree with Rebecca. I mean, I think this really is going to happen. I mean, and again, I think it's you look at where follow the money. Manufacturers are investing hundreds of billions of dollars in EV development, and they're going to be producing, hundreds of new models by 2025. They're spending, Deloitte reports that manufacturers are planning to spend $300 billion on EVs over the next 10 years. In the US, we'll have something like 130 different EV models by 43 different brands in 2 years from now. Wow. I mean, so I mean, that's a lot. And to me, if you need any further proof, rewatch the Super Bowl. There were, 7 EV car commercials during the Super Bowl this year. When they start actually advertising for these vehicles, now it's something. And so I really believe that's happening. Locally, it is happening too. In Wisconsin and in the MGE service territory, we're seeing an upward trend in EV registrations. Between the fall of 2020 and the spring of 2021, Wisconsin EV registrations increased by 121%. And over the same period in the MGE service territory, we increased 88%. And we're the service territory that sort of started, with EVs to begin with. And so for us still to be having increases of that level, I think says something too.
I love it, Cari Anne. And I've driven past your new charging hub on East Washington Avenue a couple times now. I almost want to just stop at it sometime to say I did. I love seeing that there. And as
Thanks.
all of you know, I struggle with this question all the time because I've been a driver for 5 years now, and I love it so much. And I just want to tell everyone, you don't know what you're missing out on, but it's that balance between, people just need to experience it for themselves. And I don't want to be shoving it down anyone's throat and be like, this is the future, get on board or get left behind.
Well, I'm glad you've taken notice of it, Kristin. And I'll just put in a plug for the people at our company who do survey work to determine what our customers want in the future. Rebecca, some of those people well, because you've worked with them, but they identified the need for this EV hub in that location in our community because there's a lot of multifamily housing there. And those are folks that maybe want an EV, but don't have at-home charging available to them. And that location in our community, you provide 16 chargers, right there next to all that multifamily housing. It makes an EV charging essentially quite close to home charging available to people who otherwise wouldn't have it. And so that is a way that we're trying to reach the demand of those, so that all people can benefit from this technology, not just the few.
What do you think are some of the craziest, most unexpected things that we should be preparing ourselves for in the future? And they can be industry related or not industry related. But I know, Lauren, I can tell from your face, you've got something really good in mind on this.
Well, when I was thinking about this question, I sort of went, right, in 2050 is 28 years from now. So I went backwards and, 28 years in the past is 1994. And just think how much our industry has changed from 1994 to 2022. It's breathtaking. And I do think the pace of change is even faster now. Mm-hmm. I actually, if I had to guess, I would think it's going to be something in the building sector. That's just my gut. I mean, we already now have highways that will charge cars as you drive over them. We have roofs that have, photovoltaics within the roof tiles, which I could not have imagined in 1994. But, we're going to need some pretty significant changes in the building sector. And I know there's a lot of work being done there now with regards to heating, as well as cooling. And I don't even know where to begin with that. So I say the craziness will be somewhere there. I don't know what it's going to look like because it hasn't happened yet.
Yeah. What do you think, Rebecca?
Oh, I was going to ask Cari Anne because I can see her leaning in. Girl, what do you think 2050 is going to be like? I'll wait till the end.
I don't know about 2050 either, but I agree with Lauren that I believe it's going to be in the building sector. There's a lot of there's just huge opportunity there. And we in Wisconsin, we live in a cold climate and we cannot just be, like right now we do need natural gas. We cannot be cold, here. We can't be without that in the winter, but there's going to be something that changes that. I think there's that. I think there's also, we're going to be getting accustomed to using power differently, very differently, and perhaps using it when it's actually produced, as opposed to, like when the sun is shining. Right now, I charge my electric vehicle at night because I get a beneficial rate for doing that. In the future, I'm probably going to be charging that in the middle of the day, like a beautiful day like today, because perhaps then it's, extremely inexpensive coming directly from the sun, but that's when it's being produced. I just think those kinds of things, when we use power, how we use it, that's going to change dramatically. And our mindsets around that are going to change. We'll be doing things that we would have never thought we would have before with energy.
All right, I'm going to take a break from this energy nerd circus you guys have going on here. And I'm going to zoom out as your resident futurist with two provocative ideas for what will be true by 2050. One is, I think we're going to have some sort of a Geneva Convention for cyber attacks. Between now and I would say probably over the next 5 years, depending on the global situation, because we're going from a dual power to a multipolar power world. And when you have multiple poles of power, the world automatically becomes less stable. So, and cyber, if you haven't read Nicole is her first name. The book is This Is How They Tell Me the World Ends. She's the cyber reporter for the New York Times. Please read it. So I think what we're going to end up after we've got a lot of cyber war that happens, we're going to end up with a cyber Geneva Convention that is going to govern cyber. And I think that's going to help a lot of utility companies who are playing whack-a-mole right now and trying to get ahead, but it's very difficult to get and stay ahead. So that's one. Here's my second one. I think we're going to be living easily to 120, 130 years, and many of us will be able, and by 2050, many of us will be able to would be classified as cyborgs in today's standard. So in today's standard, if you have a significant computer implanted device, you can technically be listed as a cyborg. And I believe that, I know Lauren's getting really excited right now. She's like, what device can I get? How can I get that listing? Kristin, you seem less just based on your face. Listener, Kristin right now has got a scary face.
No, those who know me know I'm like the most paranoid person in the world, and that really freaks me out.
Sorry, but I guess what I want to say here about the cyborg thing, that's a good headline. But what I want to say is that the technology of being human is going to be fundamentally different. CRISPR as a technology that allows you to do gene editing, something very important that just happened last week is the US Patent and Trademark Office said that one organization that is privately funded is the original CRISPR technology trademark holder, and the other organization that was publicly funded and would have put CRISPR technology into the public domain is not the patent holder. So we have this amazing technology that allows us to do gene editing, and having it be privately versus a publicly held technology, I just think what's going to happen with the human potential movement and how we experience being human in the future is going to be significantly different.
Yeah, so I want to be a bionic woman.
Some would say you already are, Azar.
Okay. All right, let's move on then to my favorite question and our final question, which is, if you had all the power in the industry, what would you choose to do with it?
It's sort of a run-on sentence, but here we go. So the current patchwork of overlapping jurisdictions in the electric industry doesn't lend itself to the rational design and operation of infrastructure that's critical to the health and safety of our nation and to our economy, much like we were just discussing. We need to solve that. We've got to resolve and remove all of the regulatory barriers and eliminate market power in the industry. We've got to ensure that consumers are protected by the best decision-making, processes that are possible. So divorced from politics and based on all pertinent information. So make sure that they can get the information that they need to make the right decisions. And, you know, I think we need to design and construct the clean energy grid, the high voltage grid in the most cost-effective manner possible, which means it's got to be done from a national level that's also probably going to include Canada and Mexico.
Interesting. Thanks, Lauren. Rebecca, I can tell you're holding out to be last. So
I was just thinking what a small list Lauren created. Just a tiny little list.
Okay. Well, I'll go then, because I'd love for Rebecca to go to be our anchor as well, actually, to bring us across the finish line. But, you know, just a little context first, which is that, you know, I am a problem solver by profession and a collaborator by nature. I firmly believe that, you know, problems should be solved proactively by working together on common goals wherever possible. There's currently, as we discussed earlier, significant gaps in how we can achieve our energy goals for the next decade and beyond. And I just think the only way to bridge those gaps is to work together despite our many differences. The 6th assessment report on the IPCC was released last week. The document is vast, right? It's a huge document, but within it, it repeatedly identifies polarization as one of the biggest impediments to achieving global energy and climate goals. This is just one quote from that document. Political affiliation and partisan group identity contribute to polarization on the causes and state of climate change, as well as delayed mitigation and adaptation action, most notably in the US. So if I had all the power, including a nice little magic wand, I would wave away the strident partisan and tribal gridlock that's marring us right now. And I'm not talking about just politicians. I'm talking about everyday citizens, everyday people too. I believe that we actually agree on more than we think we do. And if we just would listen and identify those items upon which we agree, focus on those, that we could actually make some progress. So that's what I would do if I had all the power.
It's like a mic drop, Cari Anne.
Yeah, that was really good, Cari Anne. Thank you.
You're welcome.
I love it. And I back up that you're a collaborator, and I appreciate that about you so much.
Well, thanks.
Yeah, I mean, what we wouldn't give for a little bit of social media reform, because I really do think if you look at the founding of Facebook and the proliferation of smartphones, that had a lot to do with the tribalism that we now sort of have come to expect. The thing, if I had all the power in the energy industry, I would want to give all executive teams sort of, I guess, a cyborg transplant. What I mean by this is that as we become leaders in our field, certainly as you get into the executive ranks of an organization, you get there because of your expertise. And what is expertise but years upon years upon years, which by definition are historic of experience. But to be a responsible steward and a responsible architect of the future that you want your children and your grandchildren to inherit, you can't hold on to your past in a precious way. You actually have to do one of the most unselfish things ever, which is to put others first, to put your children and your grandchildren first. So if I had all the power in the energy industry, what I would do is I would want every leader to be able to, without pain, to put their own self-interest to the side and to think about the kind of world we want our kids and grandkids to inherit, and to think about what the role of energy is to creating that future world.
There's your mic drop, I think.
That was like beautiful. It warmed my heart. And just having all of you here was such an honor. And like I said, it warmed my heart. I love seeing these amazing women here on International Women's Day. We're recording on International Women's Day. So it's really a highlight for me. And I appreciate you taking the time to come on.
Thank you, Kristin and Cari Anne and Lauren, for being leading women in this field, which so badly needs people who collaborate and are visionary and are problem solvers, and all of you are those things. It's really an honor to be in service with you all.
Thank you so much.
Yeah, thanks, Rebecca. Thanks for joining us today.
Thanks, guys.
Thank you to all of our listeners for tuning in. Please support our work. You can subscribe to the Electric Wire podcast if you haven't already, and you can follow us on Twitter at The Electric Wire. Thanks also to the members of the Customers First Coalition for supporting this podcast. Our members are Dairyland Power Cooperative, Madison Gas and Electric, the Municipal Electric Utilities of Wisconsin, WPPI Energy, Renew Wisconsin, the Citizens Utility Board, the International Brotherhood of Electrical Workers Local 2150, and the Wisconsin Electric Cooperatives Association. Thanks again for listening. We'll have a new episode next month.